Okay, so let's restart. Bettina Krings, would you like to make a short introduction or?
Yes, of course.
That would be nice. Thank you.
Yes. So, hello everybody. I hope you had a nice break. And now we are joining for our afternoon session. And it's really, really a huge pleasure for me to introduce Professor Ursula Huws. She is a sociologist and she is a professor of labor and globalization at University of Hertfordshire in the UK. And at the same time, she is the director of Analytica Social and Economic Research. Ursula, very, very early, she started to analyze the impact of digital technologies, or as we said, decades before, we said information and communication technologies, on labor and labor markets. Where public debate was much more focused on information society, Ursula already strengthened very much the shifts of work and of organization pattern and issues of gender and division of labor nationally and globally. And because of that, maybe, and because of her creativity, I think she was extremely, and she is still extremely successful in gaining projects, national and on European projects. And she guided huge consortiums on European level, and also in one European project, I had the opportunity to learn from her and to know her. At the same time, she developed a huge network of experts, and she developed and founded the journal Work Organization, Labor and Globalization. It's really impossible to name her list of publications and books and scientific outcomes. And at the same time, Ursula is also a very important voice in public engagement with regard to critique of working conditions. And I very much appreciate this point, Ursula. She's an expert of Marxist theory. Digital capitalism, informational capitalism, gig economy, very early as well, Ursula redefined these shifts mentioned above on labor markets into Marxist theory and discussed relevant issues for sociology of work and global capitalism. In her book, Labor in Contemporary Capitalism, What's Next? She opened very nice questions, and I would like to open also our afternoon session with these words on page 7. What is clear from all this is that the discussions taking place today have precedents in other periods of restructuring. Each time a new wave of automation comes along, it takes people by surprise, rocking their known world to the foundations and making them question every assumption they have taken for granted in the past. Not just about how economies and labor markets work, but even about the foundations of our social order. So Ursula, it's wonderful that you are here, and we are very, very happy to hear your reflections on crowdwork.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Bettina, for that lovely introduction. I should correct one thing. I retired from the University of Hertfordshire at the end of February. I'm no longer an academic.
Oh, okay.
Wow, is it liberating?
Yeah.
I'm a lot poorer, but with so many fewer emails to read, I'm so much happier. And it's great to see them because we've worked together. We worked together, I think, on the sewing project back in the 90s. So your career has kind of intersected with mine in various ways over the years, and so it's a great pleasure to see you again. I hope you can see the presentation that I'm sharing on the screen. I'm losing all my confidence in Zoom technology after a series of mishaps, but I'm pleased to be joining you. for the conclusion of what looks like a really, really interesting project. I didn't get a chance to see the presentations this morning, but I have had a chance to look at some of the reports, and I think you've obviously been doing really great and interesting and useful work. Anyway, I want to start by giving a little bit of a historical context to this topic of crowd work or platform work or whatever you want to call it. Because I do think it's not a new thing that sprung out of nowhere. It represents a convergence of a number of pre-existing trends that have been going on in some cases for decades, but which kind of became visible after the financial crisis of 2008, although a lot of them were already being studied as kind of minority trends before that point. And these, of course, are linked with digitalization and globalization. And the first of these is a general erosion of labour standards and protection that I guess started kicking in during the sort of Reagan-Thatcher period in the sort of as neoliberal thinking started to become dominant and crept into the European politics in a very diluted form, in the form of a kind of levelling up of some countries and a levelling down of others. The use of online platforms for managing work on a just-in-time basis has been going on for a very long time within companies. For instance, supermarket chains are working out how to get operators to the shift at the last minute, or call centres, or the management of global supply chains in manufacturing and so on. So the use of digital means to get workers to tasks just in time is not a new thing. It's sometimes seen as a feature of what our colleagues in Brazil always call Toyotism, in going back 20 or 30 years. The development of a global reserve army of workers equipped with digital skills and speaking global languages, which again, I suppose that kind of kicked into visibility at the moment that the Berlin Wall came down and the whole world was opened up for capitalism in a kind of new way. New sources of labour in Eastern Europe and in Asia became visible, and that in the 90s was a strong trend with the beginnings of the development of offshore outsourcing to countries like India, the Philippines, and so on. An increasing standardization of tasks. Again, this is a long historical trend, well, dated back to the 60s at least, but which kind of has been gathering momentum. But more importantly, in terms of the provision of services, especially, since the growth of general access to the internet, the increasing use, just by ordinary people who are doing their shopping, looking for service, the increasing use of Google or other search engines to find what you're looking for actually meant an erosion of all the traditional means of finding services, like, you know, ads in local newspapers or telephone books or postcards in the window of the local cigarette shop or whatever. So there's been this huge growth of people using digital means to find goods and services, which channels them through digital channels. So it makes it increasingly difficult for people to sell their services or buy their services by other means. It sort of funnels everybody in to the digital world, if you like. And then dating to about 2004, 2005, there was a further evolution in the global outsourcing of digital work, extending to SMEs, the advantages that were previously only available to large corporations. In the 1990s, if you wanted to get your software developed in Bangalore in India, you had to invest a whole lot of money. Only big companies could do it. You had to find local suppliers. You had to, you know, take major risks You have to train the workforce, you have to, you know, the transaction costs were extremely high, and the risk of failure was quite high. But around 2004, 2005, these new kinds of organizations grew up, like Freelancer, Amazon Mechanical Turk, Elance, Odesk, and so on, which took the risk out of it by using a business model whereby the platform took a percentage cut of the transaction. So even a very small company or even an individual could find a graphic designer in the global market. And you didn't have to get on a plane and go out to Vietnam to find your graphic designer. You could use the platform, and the platform created an online marketplace for you, and you know, removed the risk, but took a very large a tax, so to speak, a percentage of, normally a percentage either from the buyer or the seller or from both, to pay for it. So this created a model which was then available after the financial crisis to later types of online platforms, like, for instance, Airbnb and Uber, who extended that model. So instead of using it for digital services, they started using it for actual physical services. Again, using the platform to link the supply and demand for the service and paying for it by taking a rent. But that started before the crisis in digital services, and it moved to non-digital services around 2010, 2011. That's when TaskRabbit and Uber started, around then. And another aspect of all this, which is a trend which is growing particularly rapidly, of course, in developing countries, it grows in proportion to how much of the economy is informal. Has been a growing, what you might call, formalization of the informal economy, of people instead of just being paid, employed casually and paid cash in hand, being employed through, if you like, capitalist intermediaries, and thus bringing informal casual workers who've always been with us in large numbers, but bringing them under the discipline, under, if you like, capitalist work discipline for the first time. So, oh, I've just got a weird message. Right. So before going on to talk specifically about platform labour, I think it's important to warn against overgeneralizing. Online platforms and digital companies more generally, you know, are global organizations. Uber exists around the world in the same way that Microsoft does, or Facebook or whatever. And we tend to think of them as global platforms using their standard models. And indeed, there's now a big literature, well, a growing literature, on the use of, you know, platforms like rideshare platforms like Uber and Didi, or food delivery platforms like in Europe, Deliveroo, but in other parts of the world, other platforms on similar models. And this literature very much draws attention to the similarities in the use of similar algorithms and the similar practices of giving the workers independent contractor status, although in fact they don't have much autonomy, and so on. And so I think there's a kind of tendency to think, oh, these are global models, these are global practices, what works here was going to work there, and to start extrapolating from one context to another, not only in terms of understanding labour processes and so on, but also in terms of thinking about what organisation strategies should be and what we should do about them. And it seems to me that this is quite dangerous, because it's ignoring the highly uneven way in which capitalism has developed, and the very big differences there are in different geographical contexts. The same practice can be introduced in one geographical context and have very, very different social impacts than those it has in another geographical context. These could be gender impacts, they could be impacts on the relationship of the wage to what the average wage is in that locality. There could be all kinds of differences. And just very briefly, to summarize what these contextual differences are, there are some situations where digital technologies are being introduced as part of a process of commodification. India is rural India, especially, is a good example, but you could point to parts of Africa, parts of Latin America, parts of Indonesia, other parts of the world, where the vast majority of existing employment is informal. I mean, there are a lot of countries where more than 85% of work is in the informal economy. And in that situation, the introduction of digitalization is experienced by workers. Very often, it might be the first time they've ever been paid other than in cash. It might be their first interaction with the digital world, the first time they've actually used a smartphone in connection with managing their daily lives in some way or other. And the experience of entering this new world and this new form of corporate discipline is very, very different from a situation where it's being introduced in a context where the dominant employment model is one of decommodification. I mean, here Denmark is an example, but you could take other European countries where during the 20th century, there was a very significant decommodification compared with earlier phases of capitalism. And regulation was introduced, workers' rights were introduced, public services were introduced for the whole population. The vast majority of the population is in the formal economy, in regulated employment. And so the introduction of digital platforms in that kind of a context has a very, very different impact. It becomes a form of casualization, it becomes a form of diluting regulations, it becomes a way of evading the local regulatory systems. And then there's a third kind of context, which the UK is typical of, also the United States, I would argue, where this process of eroding the mid-20th century decommodification that took place has already been massively eroded in countries like the UK. It's been stripped away right back since the 1970s. And so the introduction of platform labour in a country like the UK is again taking place against a very different background, because it's in a context where the majority of the workforce are not in formal employment, as they are still somewhere like Denmark. A majority of them might be in what work that could be loosely defined as casual, but not casual in the sense of an informal cash economy that you would find in a developing economy, but a different kind of casualization. Anyway, I don't want to go on about this too long, but I think it's really important to not just kind of try and take solutions from one context and apply them in another, because they often have very unexpected consequences. And there is a fashion, we saw in the 1990s, there was a sort of neoliberal fashion for people from companies like the McKinsey Global Institute were going around the world advising governments, the government of Brazil, the government of India, and the government of the UK as well, and trying it on with the European Commission as well, trying to push neoliberal welfare models like family tax credits was a big thing they were pushing in the 90s. But there is kind of at the moment, there's a kind of left-wing version of that, with particular models of universal basic income being kind of pushed onto people from above, so to speak, as like the magic bullet that's going to solve all the problems of the digital economy. And it might solve some problems in some ways, but it's not necessarily going to solve all of them. And it's not only scientifically a bit dubious to try and take it from one context to another, because the contexts are different. But it's also, I would argue, very undemocratic to try and do that, because ultimately each, so to speak, working class in its own context, with its own institutions and its own laws and its own regulatory system, which is path dependent. It seems to me that the democratic solution has to be that the solution is one that emerges from a dialogue with workers and trade unions and other democratic organizations in that particular context. So we need bottom-up solutions. We can't just find magic solutions in the sky. So anyway, sorry to go on about that a little bit, but I do get quite irritated by all these people who have, oh God, there's my phone. I think, sorry, I'm just going to ignore it. I forgot to turn it off. Anyway, sorry. Sorry about that. Anyway, to go on. My phone is ringing my hearing aids. That's why it's really difficult for me to talk when it's ringing. It's stopped now. Let's go back. Oops. Right. So I now want to talk a little bit about terminologies, because there is a lot of confusion about crowd work, platform work, digital labor, a lot of different terminology that's being thrown around that makes it really difficult to do scientific research. So first of all, I think it's useful, although terminologies usually become out of date very quickly. Anything to do with technology changes very, very fast. Not only do the technologies change, but the business models change. And the business models change partly as a result of people resistance. You know, as people become aware of the problems with platforms, municipalities and national governments start to try to regulate them, and then they respond to that regulation by changing their business practice, or workers organize and get an agreement, so they respond to that agreement by changing. So there's a kind of ongoing process of mutual adaptation that makes it very, very difficult to find a concrete definition that is going to last more than 6 months. But it seems to be, conceptually in particular, it's useful to make a distinction between digital management of work and digital content of work, because these two things often get confused. Digital management, or algorithmic management as is increasingly called, is something that can be applied to many different types of work: manual work, non-manual work, work with a digital content, and work without a digital content. It's typically the most useful reference I find on that we have very poor typologies of digital management. There's a real need for research on types of digital management and, you know, what they do and how they work. The best study I know is this one, Kellogg, Valentine and Kristen, who talk about the 6 R's: recommending, restricting, recording, rating, replacing, and rewarding. It's a reference that's worth looking at if you're interested in this. But anyway, so these are digital management practices that can be applied by platforms, but also by other organizations too. And then when we're talking about working with the digital content, we're talking about kinds of work that can be carried out on a computing device, where the content can be transmitted by telecommunications, and there's therefore no need for co-presence. The work can also be shifted in time as well as in space, or sometimes, not always, like call center work has to be carried out in real time, even if it's remote, for instance. This is work that, you know, some of us were writing about 40 years ago, telework, e-work, whatever fashion has called it over the years, which has come back. Now the study of teleworking is now re-emerging after the pandemic as if it's a completely new thing, which is quite interesting. So anyways, I think it's useful to make a distinction between these kinds of work that can be done remotely and the kinds of work that can be digitally managed, and realize that they're not the same thing. So a platform work or crowd work, in some definitions, again, can be defined as work that's broken down into standardized units or tasks or specified assignments, in which digital platforms act as intermediaries in the supply and demand for labour. Now, these may or may not have digital content, but they do involve digital management. So it represents, if you like, an overlap between the two categories, but it's not synonymous with either. So I think that's quite a useful distinction to keep clear. And then you know, obviously, I mean, there are loads of typologies of platform work. I won't go into all of them, but it's often useful to subcategorize this further. Is it high skilled or low skilled? Is it paid or not paid? And there are some fuzzy borders there. But anyway, I'm now going to quickly present some results from some empirical work I did a few years ago. And just to present just for clarity, to present the definition we used there. And this was a series of surveys we did, 13 surveys in between 2016 and 2019 in 12 European countries. And we defined platform work. We were trying to only focus on paid work, but you know, the definition is necessarily blurred, because there are some kinds of work that the worker thinks they're going to be paid for and then they're not, like if it's rejected on Upwork or something like that. And then there are these kind of platforms where people compete to design a logo or something like that, and only one of them gets paid and the other ones don't. And, you know, so there's a sort of blurred distinction between what's paid and what's unpaid. And there's also a very unclear definition of what an online platform is, because a lot of you talk to workers and they say, oh yes, I found this work online, and then you find that it was basically a bulletin board or a platform like nextdoor.com, you know, which is exchanging neighborhood services, but the platform is not actually managing the labor process. And there are a lot of fuzzy distinctions between what's a website and what's a platform. And there's also quite fuzzy boundaries in general. There are lots and lots of people out there who are finding different kinds of casual work through lots and lots of different means. They might be doing a bit of work in a bar and a bit of work on an online platform, a bit of work here and a bit of work there. And they're finding some of it through platforms and some of it not through platforms. And it's, again, there's a fuzzy boundary there. But generally speaking, that's what we were looking at. People who found paid work through an online platform, using a threefold functional typology. We grouped work into three broad categories. One was digitally managed work with digital content. That's the kind of online work that you can carry out remotely from your own home or indeed from anywhere else. Typically platforms like Upwork or Fiverr or Clickworker or whatever. The second category was digitally managed work with a non-digital content. Carried out, where the actual work is carried out offline in public spaces. And this, I guess, is the kind of work that's received the most attention in the literature. And that is work that's carried out in public spaces, that are driving work, food delivery work, and platforms such as Uber or Foodora or Deliveroo or whatever. And the third category was digitally managed work without a digital content, but carried out in private spaces. Offline work that carried out typically in people's homes, but not always in people's homes, cleaning, household maintenance, repair work, care work, and so on. And here typical platforms would be TaskRabbit or MyHammer or childcare.com or Helpling. So that was the definition we used. And I'm now going to, I can't read the top line of my own slide. This is quite a challenge. I'm not going to just generally quickly go through our findings, but in order to make draw certain conclusions. One is that this work is very, very rarely carried out as a main form of work, and generally supplements other forms of work. These are the results from the different countries. As you can see, in the UK, we were able to run the survey twice, in 2016 and 2019. So we were able to see the change over a 3-year period. So note what an enormous growth there was just in that 3-year period. In these, the top one is people who do some kind of platform work, at least a weekly. The second one is people who do it at least monthly, and the other is people who do it more occasionally. As you can see, occasional is much more common than the other two. Secondly, it's very rarely the main source of income. The vast majority of platform workers say it's less than 10% of their income. Again, looking at that top group. There are typically around 3 or 4% of the population in most European countries where it does constitute the main source of income, but that is actually a minority. So most platform work is done by people doing it on top of some other source of income. Secondly, this might be a little bit difficult to read. Platform work is done by people with many different kinds of employment status. The black bars on the left are the platform workers, and the rest of the bar is the people of that status in the working population. So you can see there are people who are doing it when they have full-time jobs, there are people who are doing it on top of part-time jobs, there are people who are doing it who say they're self-employed, there are people who are doing it who say they're full-time parents, but they're obviously actually doing a bit of work, there are people who are doing it who say they're retired. They're also there are also people who say they're doing it alongside more than one paid job. There are people who are doing it when they're in receipt of benefits or pensions. There are people who combine it with income from rent or investments. And the people who say themselves that they are an independent contractor, there are some, but there aren't huge numbers. This is the status that the platforms always give them. So it's a complete mess. This work is done by people right across the workforce with a whole range of different statuses. They're also very diverse in terms of gender. It's, you know, slightly more men than women in most countries, but quite varied. It's also diverse in terms of age. You've got people of all ages doing it, and in some countries you've got additional demographics like ethnicity and so on. So basically you've got this very dispersed, very diverse workforce. And what are they doing? A very high proportion say they do more than one kind of work. So you can't say, oh, these are the online workers, these are the household workers, these are the delivery workers, because not precisely, because a lot of them say they do more than one. And this yellow running errands category was a huge overlap category. But generally speaking, the blue bars, which are the taxi and delivery work, which is the one we hear most about when people talk about trade union organisation, is the smallest. The grey one, which is the people doing online work, is the largest category. There are 1 or 2 countries, Slovenia is one, and Estonia is one, where there are slightly more people doing driving delivery type work than doing household type work. But generally speaking, that people doing the household type work are more numerous, which raises the question, why don't we hear more about them? And another real important issue in looking at this work is that the digital management practices that we associate with platform workers are actually very widespread among non-platform workers. This slide shows it's one indicator of let's actually combine 2 indicators of a digital management practice. It's by no means the only indicator of digital management. And this is having to use an app or a website to be notified when work is available, or having to log the work that you've done in an online app before you get paid. So we put those two together. And the bits of the bars that are in blue are the at least weekly platform workers. The bits that are in orange are the less frequent platform workers. But look at the bits in grey. Those are non-platform workers. And as you can see, there are more, in percentage terms, non-platform workers using these apps than there are platform workers. So we have to see digital management as something that's much bigger than just something that affects platform workers. It's something that's affecting workers right across the workforce. And here we can see in the UK, we can see how it grew. This is 3 years before the pandemic, effectively, from 2016 to 2019. The number of platform workers doubled, but the proportion of non-platform workers went up very significantly by 100 from under 10% to over 15%. So this is a really a phenomenon that has to be grappled with. Another example is the use of customer ratings. We didn't have this question in the early survey, so we've only got this data for these 7 countries. But as you can see, the blue bars are the platform workers, the frequent platform workers who are evaluated on the basis of customer ratings. But look at all the people on the grey bars who are not platform workers, who are nevertheless managed according to customer ratings. So anyway, so quickly, as I said, these surveys were done, the last one was done in 2019 before the pandemic. We don't have good data for what's happened since the pandemic, but clearly there have been huge changes, which I'm just going to summarize quickly, which you can say there's been the brake and the accelerator at different parts of the economy. But the point is that the pandemic arrived in a labour market that was already in a process of very dynamic change. That doubling that you saw between 2016 and 2019 in platform work in the UK was not untypical elsewhere. So we were already seeing this very rapid platformization process going on. And then along comes the dynamic, and it's like jumping onto an escalator in a way. The braking effect, some parts of the economy screeched to a halt. You know, we could include Airbnb in that. The travel and the tourist industries came to a standstill. There was a fracturing and a shortening of a lot of global supply chains. The collapse of very many small and medium-sized firms, retail, cultural, other service industries. A lot of these high street shops that are slowly, some are slowly starting to open now, but some will never open. And huge increases in unemployment, obviously, and bankruptcies, for some companies in some sectors have gone to the wall. Accelerating effects, dramatic growth in last mile delivery services, people locked down, needing to order things. And that's brought about a huge convergence, which has very much affected a lot of platform workers, between courier services, platform delivery service, food delivery services, taxi services, and retail delivery workers and postal workers. You know, you've seen Uber drivers converted into Uber Eats delivery workers and so on, and Deliveroo riders delivering groceries instead of ready meals, and Amazon delivery workers everywhere you look. And it's an interesting thing to study, because a lot of these workers historically have very different kind of employment statuses, like postal workers are employees, retail people who work for big supermarket delivery chains are often employees, platform workers have this very disputed employment status, as do Amazon riders, etc. So it's quite an interesting field that the effects of all this convergence are playing out in new dialogues between the different trade unions that represent these groups of workers, for example. So there's also, of course, been this dramatic growth in teleworking, including people who didn't want to be teleworkers, which is different from people who studied teleworking 30 or 40 years ago. On the whole, were studying people who basically were teleworking from choice, or even if that was a rather constrained choice. But now we have a lot of people who are teleworking with no choice at all. And we've seen an absolutely huge growth in the market share of big corporations, and a growth in the outsourcing of public services. And this has, of course, meant a bonanza for global corporations in some sectors. This is what, you know, has paid for Jeff Bezos to get in his rocket and go off into space. But what have been the impacts on workers? On the one hand, there's been a growing polarization between the isolated workers stuck in their homes, teleworking, and the workers who have been risking their lives out on the streets, bringing them the goods and services that they need to survive and taking away their rubbish, and delivering the services that have to be delivered somewhere else, like hospital workers and school workers and so on. And also workers in certain industries like food processing industries who have had to work right through the pandemic. But among both the fixed workers and the footloose workers, in both cases, they are now much more likely to be working directly or indirectly for very large corporations than they were, because it's the small businesses that are going to the wall. And there's a huge growth in the algorithmic management and digital surveillance. The footloose workers are surveyed through GPS, you know, tracking their every move on the street, or and you know, every time they deliver a service, you know, getting user ratings from customers and so on. But also the teleworkers are increasingly subjected to new forms of very sophisticated digital surveillance, using the webcam to watch what they're doing, using in call centers now these very sophisticated systems that analyze the emotion in the conversation, and they send the call center workers little emojis saying, hey, okay, your customer's getting angry, you know. Very, very intensive surveillance at a very minute level. And of course, there's been a growing financial precariousness across the population, growing reliance on benefit systems, but also, I think on the upside, I think a changing attitude to employers. In many cases, increasing propensity of workers to challenge the systems they're working on, to organize, and to use digital tools for doing so. I've got a new issue of the journal I edit, which is just about to come out, and there's some really interesting articles about how it's about the platform workers after the pandemic, basically. It's about like almost like you could say new consciousness that's sweeping through as a result of the partly a cynicism about the employers' strategies and failure to protect them in the pandemic, and in some cases also a kind of stepping into the vacuum that's been left by inefficient government, where governments have failed to provide services like food distribution for poor populations and things like that. Community-based organizations have started organizing, stepping in to fill that vacuum in a way that is quite interesting. Anyway, sorry, that's a big distraction. So because what I really wanted to do is to draw some conclusions from this research. First, being a platform worker is not a primary or stable identity for the vast majority. And in a survey, most of them would not say, I'm a platform worker. It's something that they do on top of like their main occupational identity, which explains some of the weird discrepancies you get in survey results. It's a lot, it depends on the questions you ask. Secondly, it is not the main source of income for most people. It represents all or most of income for only a small minority. Third, although there are significant numbers of platform workers doing visible kinds of work in public spaces, like driving and delivery work, that enables them to find each other and enables them to organize in the same way that in the 1880s, dock workers and railway workers were able to find each other and organize. There are even larger numbers of workers doing more hidden forms of work, either working online or providing household services, who are not visible to each other, who are working in private spaces and who don't have access to these means to organize, which reminds us, again, going back to the 1880s, I mean, that's just one among many parallels, but it was a period in the UK when the general trade union movement, in which Karl Marx's daughter was very much involved. It was and Engels was, it was the period when that grew. And it reminds us that factory workers organized and transport workers organized. But if you look at the statistics, very, very, very large numbers of people, including the majority of working women, were working as domestic servants in people's houses. And they did not organize. They could not organize. And I think we have to draw some implications on that, because we now have a new wave of platform workers working in people's homes in hidden ways also. I think the other main message that we need to learn from this is that the digital management practices associated with platform work extend to many other types of work. They are not unique to platform work. So what are the kind of implications of this? First of all, forms of trade union organization that base themselves only on the shared identity of being a particular kind of platform worker, that organize on the basis of occupations. They may be useful in many ways, in drawing attention to problems or in winning victories for selected vanguards, if you like, of the workforce, but they will never be sufficient for the representation of these larger constituencies of workers, including those domestic workers and online workers. In particular, even if gains are won by those visibly organized workers in public spaces, they're unlikely to be extended to more hidden groups of platform workers if you rely only on trade union mechanisms, which brings me to my next point. There is therefore a need for trade union action to be complemented by political action. This was very much what happened in the mid-20th century in most European social democracies. The welfare states of the 20th century were not created just by syndicalism. They were created by political action, but political action hand in hand with trade union action. They couldn't have happened in many cases without the trade union action. Certainly the kind of nationalizations that took place, certainly in the UK and France. I don't know so much about other countries. For instance, the dock labour scheme that was introduced in the UK was because the dock workers were organised and fighting. The nationalisation of coal was very much linked to the militant action of coal workers. And it's the same as we look at industries like steel and so on, which were nationalised in other European countries. So this implies the introduction of new legal protections or the extension of existing legal protections, and also supplemented by effective forms of enforcement. So we need trade unions and political parties to come together, but they also need to put some sort of like legal things in place. And one of the temptations, I think, is especially in countries where labour at the moment is rather well regulated, is to say, oh, let's treat platform workers as a special kind of worker and have a special kind of directive for them, or special kind of law that applies only to platform workers, that specifies particular rights for platform workers. And there are two huge problems with that. One is you're never going to find a definition that's going to last. Because, as I said earlier, because the practice is always changing and the technology is always changing. And secondly, these companies have clever lawyers who find loopholes. So, and we've seen this in the past, if you define part-time work as work that is less than 30, less than 40 hours a week, but more than 16 hours a week, suddenly you get everybody being put on 15-hour-a-week contracts, because whatever definition is put in place will be evaded. And so, but also, as we know, the vast majority of platform workers are probably, because they're only doing it part-time, would be missed in any case. So it seems to me that makes much more sense to introduce universal rights for all workers in the same spirit as the spirit of the end of World War II and the 20th century Fordist deal, if you like. And these new rights can't just be imposed from above. I mean, it's very easy to come up with shopping lists of demands. But in fact, as I was saying earlier, it's necessary in each context to work with the existing institutions, to work with the existing models of social dialogue, with the existing social partners, and with what workers actually want. Different workers in different historical contexts may want different things. Work in one situation, people may want to say we want universal basic income. In another context, they might say, no, we want a proper health service, or we want a decent minimum wage, or whatever. Do you know what I mean? It needs to be a democratic process in each context that develops those rights. So here's my shot.
Excuse me, Ursula.
Do you want me to finish?
Yes, please.
Right. So this is my shopping list, and I've just said why shopping lists are a bad idea. So whip through that. You can look at that later on. And there are also some things that trade unions can do, which maybe if you want to ask me a question about these, I'll put them up on the slide. But it seems to me that there's a lot to be done at a local level in collaboration with other bodies. And finally, this is further reading, and coming soon, this new special issue of the journal. And there we are.
Oh.
Sorry, I got a bit distracted. So
no, thank you so much for this excellent overview of platform work, and also that you provided your results of your projects and your estimation on further work. I think it was very, very important also for us, for the project partners, as well as for our guests. There are 10 minutes, 15 minutes left for questions.
Right, I've stopped sharing.
Great. Are there questions? Antonio?
Yeah, thank you. Well, it was very, very interesting, and this it could be interesting for us that you could mention this shopping list, as you mentioned, of suggestions for the unions. Considering these experiences that we were analyzing different countries, these suggestions that you were mentioning were a result of these comparative European comparative studies, or are just from your experience the suggestions for intervention of unions, or for self-organization of digital platform workers, or for, because we found, as Chavamako referred in the end of the morning session, that one conclusion that we can have is the heterogeneous diversity of all forms of organization of workers through the platforms. But well, once you were very quickly going through.
Do you want me? Should I put that slide back up? I can easily do that.
Perhaps, or
there. Can you see that?
Not yet.
Yeah. Right. Well, where this comes from, it's very difficult to actually, it's like, you know, who owns each drop of water in a wave. These come from, I've been involved for the last, well, certainly since 2012, we had a big cost action, if you remember, which some of you were involved in, where these things were discussed with a lot of different partners. We had trade unions, we had policymakers at the European level. We have, sorry, my phone's ringing again, it'll stop actually. So we had this very active dialogue between academics, between policymakers from a variety of different backgrounds, including employers' organizations. And then that led to a lot of work. First of all, I did a big project with the European Occupational Safety and Health Agency, and that involved a dialogue, you know, with all the, at a European level, with different national representatives. And then these surveys, which were funded by Europa and FEPS, again, in each country, we had a national partner, and there were discussions with mainly trade union partners, but in some cases, academic or research organizations or think tanks. And then there's been a series of consultations with the European Parliament, which are still ongoing. I still have my Zoom conversations with various working groups for the European Parliament. So I suppose they've come out of a dialogue, and also outside Europe, but through the journal and so on. I'm quite well networked with colleagues in various other countries, where I'm working on a book right now with a particular focus on digital labor in developing economies. I'm co-editing with the wonderful Aditi Suri in India, but we will have contributions from Indonesia, from Brazil, from etc. So I guess there's a lot of empirical information there, which has taught me some lessons about not to overgeneralize, to always be attentive to the local context and to what people want, and particularly in relation to gender and in relation to care work. The introduction of digital platforms is extremely contradictory. I think Bettina's looked a little bit at this as well. There are, in the United States, the Domestic Workers Alliance has actually managed to use digital platforms as a way of leveraging new forms of connection among care workers, which basically enable them to get better working conditions than they had without the platforms. And again, in India, because it's a context of basically a formalization of the informal economy, the platforms in some cities have become a way of actually raising the minimum wage. So it's quite contradictory. And also in some cities, the pandemic has been used as a way of pushing the interest of platform. I mean, in some cities, platform workers have really, really suffered in India. But there have been other situations where, for example, the city council has made the rules about food delivery during the pandemic, have made it conditional that the platforms can only deliver food if they take food from street traders. And street traders are a very, very vulnerable group in the informal economy whose livelihood was disappearing. And by forcing the platforms to deliver food that's sold by street traders, they've actually, you know, it's had a very progressive impact. So I think we have to be very hyper aware that there are contradictions here, that it's not just a simple one-size-fits-all type of platform with a one-size-fits-all type of solution. That's really my point.
Yeah, thank you for this clarification, Ursula. So are there other questions? There's some minutes left.
Yes.
No.
Well, thank you very much for your very interesting and a lot of intake we received from your presentation, Ursula. I have one question that relates to the to something that you said, referring to that the definition changes a lot because the technology changes, but also because labor lawyers will always find loopholes. And this this statement raised us a lot of questions because we're now preparing legislation in Portugal and debating and so on. And to what extent do you think this is you are indeed taking into consideration that we have a global globalization and also digitalization, and therefore there is no way forward. There will always be ahead of the regulations that governments might produce to protect workers. So in my sense, it gives me the idea that it's a bit like the rabbit and the cat, something like that, and we will never catch them and frame them within our industrial relations system.
Well, I think this is where the role of the unions becomes very, very important. Legislation can establish a floor, a standard below which things shouldn't be allowed to fall. And incidentally, it can only do that if it's properly enforced. And a lot of the debates about regulation of crowd work focus only on the law. They don't focus on the enforcement. And the enforcement is the key thing, actually, especially when we're talking about migrant workers who don't have many rights or don't have much knowledge about their rights. So the enforcement is absolutely key. So the law can establish, politically, if you like, can establish a minimum threshold. But then it's up to trade unions to build from that threshold to get something better. And in different countries, they'll do that in different ways. If you have a sector level bargaining, you do it at a sector level. If you have company level bargaining, mainly, or it's the UK, it's mainly company level bargaining. You might do it at the company level. There are different national models. There are also different groups of workers have different strengths as well. So you start with the workers who are already organized or already strong, but it's very necessary to build links between those workers, and either through other kind of community-based or political organizations or other groups of workers in other unions, because without that you just get a kind of you end up creating kind of labor aristocracies, who have strong workers who have a lot of bargaining power and a lot of privilege, but who kind of pull away from the working class as a whole. What was very interesting about the mid-20th century context was that there was a kind of solidarity, rather unusually, actually, historically rather unusual solidarity between what you might call the labor aristocracy, the organized working class, and what Marx would have called the reserve army of labor. They'd fought together in the war, they'd been through the Depression together, they lived next door to each other on the Newcastle estate. So there were sort of real solidarities, and the trade unions threw in their interest with the social democratic parties and said, no, we don't just want to represent our members, we want to gain things for the whole working class, whether it was pensions, whether it was health services, whatever it was. Now, since globalization, that's become much more difficult because the reserve army of labor is not any longer people's friends and neighbors. It's people on the other side of the world. It's migrant workers who may not speak your language, may not have the same color skin, may not have the same religion, who you've been taught by the right-wing press and the right-wing parties to demonize, to see as the cause of your problems. So either it's these migrant workers on your own territory, or it's workers on the other side of the world. It's that you blame the workers in China or in India where the factories have been moved to. So it's incredibly difficult to build those solidarities between the reserve army, if you like, and organised labour. But it's not impossible, and platform workers in some ways actually are oddly enough to kind of bridge that gap. And particularly this extension of digital management across the whole workforce forms the basis for new solidarities. Suddenly, workers who 10 years ago we would have thought they have nothing in common with each other at all, like, you know, taxi drivers and IT technicians or cleaners and so on. Suddenly, they've all got the same problem of being managed by algorithms. And so maybe there's a possibility to unite around new platforms of demands around digital workers' rights. And this is one of the things that gives me great cause for optimism. And I think the pandemic also has established a kind of new kind of mood, if you like, among workers.
Mm.
Thank you.
Thank you. So there's some minutes left for last. I can't see. There's no.
My hand is risen.
Okay.
Blue hand.
Reinhard.
Ursula, could you please stop sharing?
Reinhard, please.
Yeah. I'm Reinhard from the Portuguese team. I participated in the research on the Glovo and Uber Eats people, and I wonder. You said that that it does not make sense to try to invent specific regulations for platform workers because this will not work. And I wonder, for example, would one way be to make it more or even much more difficult for companies to have bogus self-employed workers, just to create some legal instruments that help to combat bogus self-employment and bogus independent work in general, and then you have the means to stop companies hiring workers on this just-in-time basis.
Well, if I understand you right, yes, I think that's absolutely right. It seems to me the first step is to have a proper definition of self-employment. Most European countries don't have a clear definition of what a genuine freelancer, if you like, because there are genuine freelancers. There are people who genuinely work for a lot of different employers, you know, who have the right to take on assistants, who set their own wages, etc. So once you have a proper definition of self-employment, you can then say everybody who doesn't fall into this definition of like a proper freelancer is by definition, de facto, a dependent worker, and put the onus of proof onto the platform or the employer to say that they're not. At the moment, workers have to take these expensive and difficult test cases to in the UK to employment tribunals, in other countries to different mechanisms, to try to prove that they are a dependent worker. But you switch the onus of proof, and it's easy to do that once you've got a proper definition, a legal definition of self-employment. While the definition of self-employment is still fuzzy, it's going to be much more difficult to do that. And you need a definition of self-employment that works in three different ways, that works in relation to the tax system, in relation to the benefit system, and in the or social protection system, whatever you call it in your country, and in relation to employment law. And at the moment, there are divergences between these. There are people very actively working in DG Employment and Social Affairs in Brussels on actually trying to develop at a European level some sort of models. But it's difficult because the EU doesn't have a competency in relation to social protection. It does in relation to employment, but not so. But anyway, but it seems to me that that's the right way forward. So the default position is that everybody is a dependent employee. And once you've got that, I think life then becomes an awful lot easier.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I can't see any questions. So, and I think we have reached our end. I would like to thank you so much, Ursula, for this keynote. It was really great. And I think we've got a lot of good insights also for our discussion round later on. And I hope you will also be present the afternoon, Ursula. I would like to thank you so much. And I would like to give back to Nuno. Thank you.
Thank you very much too. It's been nice to talk to you.
Yes, I share my words with Bettina. And I also would like to say that we have an hour coffee break of 10 minutes. And so in 10 minutes time, let's get back here to start the round table. 10 minutes, it's enough then. We have more than time to the round table. Okay?
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. Hi, Uma.
I don't know. I think you will have to share my slide. I am having problem sharing.
Okay, just give me 1 minute.
I upgraded my computer, so since then I've been having some problems.
Yes, you're not the only one. Many people have been complaining about the new
And I'll just say next and you can just move with it. Apologies and thanks a lot.
Okay, I have it ready. Not sure if 10 minutes passed or only 8 minutes passed. Maybe we should wait 1 or 2 more minutes.
Sure. No worries.
Hi, Uma. It's Pablo, will be the moderator.
Hi, Paolo. How are you? Good?
Good, good, good. Yes, many thanks for joining to the conference.
Pleasure. Thanks. It's been very fascinating and interesting to hear since morning.
So you will have your presentation.
Yes, and I've actually given it to
Great.
I will share it. I will share it when we start,
yeah.
and then I will pass.
I thought it was easier to illustrate some things and to.
Of course. So we also have Zach and Jamie here with us, which is great.
Hello.
Hi, Zach.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us. It's really appreciated.
Good afternoon.
So now maybe 1 minute more. It's been a long day. Fatigue, Zoom fatigue is kicking in.
I guess everyone is waiting for the summer break.
And also that.
More than anything else.
Yes, for sure.
I think we can start. Okay, so let's now start the round table, and I will give the word to Dr. Pablo Sanz from Notas, our colleagues in Spain. Please, Pablo, it's your time.
Yes, yeah, many thanks, Nuno. Thank you, everyone. I'm now moderating this roundtable, the purpose of which is to give the floor to other researchers who have not been in our project, but who have conducted very interesting research on the topic of platform work, and giving them the opportunity to present their findings and therefore enrich the discussion and the debate with research outcomes from other researchers. I'm going to make a short introductions of the three researchers who are taking part in this roundtable, and then I will give them the floor to make a presentation of their main findings on the topic. First of all, we have Dr. Uma Rani, who is a senior economist at the research department of the International Labour Office. Her main research interest has been on developing economics, informal sector, minimum wages, poverty, inequality, social policies, and gender. She has also conducted quite a lot of research on platform work. She has been co-author of several reports on the topics from ILO, but also she has produced several journal articles researching platform work and working conditions, particularly in developing countries. And recently, she has also published one article analyzing the impact of the pandemic crisis of COVID-19 on platform workers. Then we also have Zachary Kilofer. I'm sorry if I pronounce bad your surname. He's researcher in the Jobs and Skill Unit at the Center for European Policy Studies. He holds a master's degree in international relations, and he's currently a PhD candidate. And he has also conducted research on platform work. He has produced several comparative reports for the European Commissions and other European agencies on the topic, where he has analyzed the business model of platform work, and also from a comparative perspective, platform workers' working conditions. And finally, we have Dr. Jamie Bootcock, who is a senior lecturer in management in the Open University. And his research focused on labor, work, gig economy, platforms, and also resistance and organizing and video games. And in relation to the topic of platform work, he has conducted a very interesting research. He has explored algorithmic management and how platform, particularly in the food delivery sector, exercise control and discipline over platform workers. He has also explored how workers can organize against algorithm management. Very interesting research. So yes, I'm very happy to have you here today, and I give you the floor. So yeah, maybe we can follow this order. So maybe Dr. Uma Rani, you can start. Yeah, the floor is yours. Many thanks.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Pablo, for the kind introduction, and thanks to Nuno and colleagues for inviting me over here for the roundtable discussion. And it was quite fascinating to hear some of the studies coming out of Europe this morning. So what I'm going to do is actually pick on some of the points that got raised in the morning and actually expand a bit, showing some of the findings we had. And I'd like to just say that you can also look at the World Employment Social Outlook 2021, which I coordinated and came out early this year, where we had done surveys of about 12,000 workers across the globe in both the online web-based platforms and as well as location-based platforms. And I'll just tell you what they are. And many of the findings that you do see there are quite similar to what you were talking about today. And I thought what would be quite interesting for this discussion is to actually get a bit more in depth into certain issues, and that's what I'm going to raise. Next slide, please. So for this particular report, actually, we tried looking at the online web-based platforms in the 4 categories: freelance, contest-based, microtask, and competitive programming platforms. And these have been growing, as Ursula said, since the 1999-2000s as a way out of a solution for the entire subcontracting that was going on in the IT sector very clearly. So, you know, there's a very clear historical transition from the way the subcontracting work went to outsourcing using digital technologies. So it's also quite very well established within the academic literature. And the second thing we tried doing in this particular report is look at some of the location-based platforms, that is the taxi and delivery. And we also spoke to about representatives of different firms that were utilizing it, and also platform companies and platform worker associations for this particular report. And there's a complete chapter which is dedicated to regulations and how work is being organized within it. But the reason why I'm picking on this point here is, next slide, please, is to show that you do have location-based platforms and online web-based platforms, as we were discussing this morning. And what's quite interesting is, irrespective of the type of platform you pick up, there are certain very common elements in the business model. And I think this is something very important to keep in mind, especially when one wants to get into regulatory issue. The second point I do want to make at this point is that we always think, when we are talking about businesses, only from the worker point of view, which is what we have been doing for a very long time at the ILO. But we are not necessarily touching the businesses per se. We are not touching the business model. We are only asking, okay, how can workers organize themselves to actually raise certain issues and questions and to bring about more fairness in their work. But I think fundamentally what is very important for us with this particular business model is to start thinking about regulation at the platform level. And here there are 4 things that I'd like to just point out very clearly and I think there's enough literature that is out there talking about algorithmic management practices and how they are controlled. And Kellogg's and colleagues' paper is one of the newest ones, which is often quoted by a number of researchers and authors. So one is the way the entire matching takes place. Irrespective of the platform, they use these different mechanisms to actually match workers and clients, which could be ratings, client reviews, sometimes certain portfolios or history profile of the workers. The second thing, which is very, very new with this platform business model, and actually it is contrary to some of the norms that we have as part of the International Labour Organization and international regulations, is the charging of commission fees to the workers, which can be as high as 40% on many of these platforms. And one of the platforms we went a bit into the detail because the reports were available as publicly available, we found that 62% of the revenue was actually generated by charging commission fees. And this is against the Private Employment Agency Convention. So, you do have certain rules and regulations already in place, but this is not actually followed, which is a concern, which is an enforcement issue, which, as very rightly pointed out by Ursula, but the point is that many people are not even aware about it. And I think this is something that needs to be taken into consideration. The third thing is about the way work is monitored on a regular basis. So, one does talk about the freedom, flexibility, autonomy that many of these workers have, but in reality, it is not so. It takes different forms, irrespective of the type of platform you're talking about. If you're talking about delivery or taxi, it is GPS. If you're talking about online platforms, irrespective of the type, like microtask or freelance or competitive programming, they have to install certain hardware or software on their computer, and they have to actually respond to the requests of the client and the platform from time to time. And fourthly and lastly, which is very important, is the working conditions of the workers are actually determined by the terms of service agreement, which are unilaterally determined. And I think this is again an entry point which needs to be looked at very carefully. Next slide, please. The second thing that I'd like to raise is with regard to, I think this is a discussion, I think Nuno said it. Well, there are 80,000 workers who are actually being engaged on this work, so it's a growing proportion. But I think what we often forget, and this is exactly the selling point of the platforms, we are generating work, we are creating work. Is that really so? I think one has to stop now and fundamentally ask a very simple question, that were these jobs available in the traditional labor market or not? And according to me, yes. Whether you're talking about taxi, delivery, care, domestic, or personal handy services, they were available in the traditional labor market. Probably what has increased to a small extent is in the delivery sector. You have a higher proportion of workers being actually hired. And much of this probably was in certain other sectors and who are moving in here. I think that's something that needs to be contextualized and remembered. Similarly, when you're talking about microtask, or competitive programming, all of these jobs were within a firm and being done. We did an interesting comparison of microtask workers in India and United States, as we had a very good sample of workers from our survey. And we found that these jobs were existing, still continue to exist, but what the major variations that you see is in terms of income. It's almost 63% less in India and about 82% less. And I think that's the point to be labored about as to how. I think David Weil talked about the fissuring of the workplace, and there's further fissuring that is happening through these platforms, and this cannot be ignored. And on online web-based platforms, we very clearly see, everybody knows what the wage rates, minimum wages are, but even if you look at global wages, it's about $3.4, and you have about 50% of the workers earning less than $2.1. And I think the bigger crux comes in here with regard to how the payment happens between workers in developed and developing countries. At least from the sample that we did for the global survey, we found workers earn 60% less, especially on freelance platforms. And there are various reasons why this happens. It's also not just, there are various ways this is actually tracked, and Linda did talk about some things, and I'm happy to discuss that much more in future. And this is with regard to the nature of jobs that are actually outsourced to different parts of the world. Next slide, please. The second issue, the third issue that I'd like to raise is the whole issue of minimum wages. I think in this whole debate on digital labor platforms, it comes down that workers should at least get some minimum wages. And I think that it's very problematic there, because I think we are, number one, not recognizing that this existed within the traditional labor market. The second thing is, if you just take the case of taxi sector. Now, the taxi sector, if you look at the traditional labor market, the fares were determined by the local municipality or states or regions whatsoever. And it is city councils in many cases which would also do it. And they would take into consideration not only the distance traveled, but also take into consideration what a basic minimum fare would be, assuming that there is a lot of waiting period that is there for many of these workers. So, these are calculations that have been made based on certain aspects. And now you have these platforms coming in, which start playing the whole demand supply issue, and then go about determining what the price could be. And okay, there is surge pricing in the case of taxi for certain period of times. So, if one argues for this minimum wages, it's far below what the sectoral wages are determined within any jurisdiction or any area for any types of jobs that are there, and which has been hard-fought union struggle to get there. So, we are just going back again in a way with these platforms and getting back into the thing saying, okay, let's first get into fighting for minimum wages and then we'll go further. But I think one needs to put this debate a bit more in a context and argue that, there has to be very clear fair pay benchmarks for much of this work that is happening if it is to be allowed, taking into consideration a number of different factors. Next slide, please. And finally, one more point before I do the final. I just want to show, I think this was Hungary, which went about arguing this morning, saying that yes, you see this in Hungary, but also in a number of other developing countries, where the earnings that you get from platform is much better than probably the traditional labor market. I think one needs to understand here as to why people are coming into the platforms. It is because the local labor market situation is probably not good. I think there's a very clear need to look into the employment policy while we talk about the working conditions. The two cannot be looked separately, but together. The second issue I'd like to raise is, it's very important to keep in mind when the survey was done. If the survey was being done during a period where the platforms are building their network effects and actually providing a lot of bonuses, incentives and all, which you see clearly from this slide, where 70% of the workers in most countries get, of course, these is going to be higher than what the workers in the traditional labor market are earning. Why is it also higher? It's also because many of these platforms workers are actually taking the work away from the traditional workers because they are able to offer the services at a very low price. This is actually very nicely linked to what Bettina raised, saying that, there's a cultural shift, there's a cultural change. Yes, there is a cultural change. That's what platforms have actually brought about. And I think this begs a very moral, ethical consideration on our part, especially as consumers too, saying, is this having everything cheap, would it actually bring about more welfare for the entire community or society or what? So I think this is the entire argument that needs to be looked at. And you can see from the slide, as you know, how much the workers earn, how much time do they have to wait, and how many hours they work to get those wages. I think this is very, very important to keep in mind, and how much of less social protection benefits they have. Next slide, please. There was a discussion about you can sort of, okay, I just want to labor one more point with regard to informal economy workers versus platform economy workers, which is often again argued by many, including the platform companies, saying that they are providing better opportunities for workers in the informal economy. I'd just like to show this is not the case. The freedom and autonomy that many workers in the informal economy have, you do not have it the minute you're on platform, because you're dictated by your ratings. You cannot cancel because there will be repercussions. You will have your accounts deactivated, and there's absolutely no dispute resolution mechanism that exists for many of these workers to actually help them out. Next slide, please. And finally, the last point I'd like to labor upon is the algorithmic management practices. Now, we do talk about transparency. There are emerging laws of algorithm that are coming by, but I think not many people are aware of the fact that the access to the source code of algorithms are protected by the trade secrecy laws and by intellectual property rules at the WTO level. It's not really accessible for anything unless and until there's a huge case that is filed, and then the lawyers can have access to it. So I think given that algorithmic management rules the lives and experiences of the workers on these platforms, it's very important to bring it within the fore of labor law regulation. Rather, I think in the report that we published in February, I do argue for algorithmic transparency, but I think an important question to ask would be, what are the rules or norms that are required for algorithms at different levels and stages to ensure that the algorithmic outcomes are fair and just? I think this would be something much more important for us to look at. And the last two slides, I'll just show it, and Nuno, you can just show that, which goes about showing the different practices of regulation for platform workers that have existed, which shows very clearly the heterogeneity that is there. And then ILO goes about giving 15 recommendations in the final slide as to what needs to be done, which is beyond labor law and goes into competition and competition law and emerging law of algorithms. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Many thanks, Uma. It has been very, very interesting. You have raised a lot of very relevant issues: geographical disparity, minimum income, algorithm management and control. So, many thanks. We can continue with the next presentation by Zachary Kilofer. The floor is yours. You also have around 10-15 minutes for presenting your research.
Thank you. I'm actually going to set a timer for myself because I have a bad habit of going over time. So here I go. And also I have a bit of a technical difficulty with one of my cameras. So I hope that you are able to see my face and also hear my voice simultaneously. If not, maybe look at the group options. If you have it on speaker view, I think you're going to see a black screen, but if you have it on the group view or whatever it's called, you'll see everyone, and one of the screens will have me. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to this very interesting video conference. And it's also nice to see some familiar faces. I'd also mention that I can personally recommend Uma's paper, which she was just presenting. I found it incredibly helpful in my own work. It's very high quality and very much up to date. I don't have a PowerPoint to share with you, but I've been taking notes throughout, and I have some points or arguments that I would like to raise and perhaps give a little bit of food for thought. And I think that I'll have something to say which everyone can agree with, and probably something to say which everyone can disagree with. So hopefully it will be a bit of a food for thought. So a few of my points that I'd like to make here. The first is that we're mostly concerned about trying to achieve some better degree of fairness. And organization is one way that we can think about this. But in a broader sense, I'm much more in favor of taking a broad legislative approach to achieving fairness for platform workers. And this is partially because I think that more traditional forms of organization don't make sense for many, many people who would be platform workers classified in whatever way. And also because court cases are the traditional way of dealing with such questions, and court cases have proven to be much too slow compared to the progressive speed that platforms are able to develop. So generally speaking, I think we need more forward-looking legislation, ideally at EU level, which is going to try to tackle issues of fairness for platform workers. That being said, organization can still be very much appropriate, but this tends to be in more specialized cases. And these account for, in my view, relatively few platforms, but relatively many workers. And so I'd like to clarify a little bit about this. The first point here is that we talk a lot, or I've heard many times so far today, we need to think about the on-location platform workers in bucket 1 and the online platform workers in bucket 2. And that's already, for me, a fairly large issue, because I've, in dozens and dozens of platform worker interviews and interviews with the platform workers or operators and so on in different countries and so on, you must go a little bit deeper. I think that when we think about food delivery or last minute or last mile delivery services, these kind of logistic services, right? And also in personal transport, these taxi-like services, this is for me in a very special little box on its own. And this should not necessarily be grouped with people who are, for example, handymen or homme de tout faire, however you'd like to say this, or people who are offering cleaning services or a number of other things which can be performed on location. And the reason is that there are certain characteristics of work which lend themselves better to some kind of collective representation. The first thing, which is very easy to think about, is, are we experiencing or can we observe bogus self-employment? If you do experience or if you do observe bogus self-employment, well, suddenly the question of organization becomes much simpler. Of course, you have the right to, it's very clear that you would receive benefit from collective representation in this case. But there's also other elements, such as, are the workers intended to be fungible or to be perfectly replaceable? In the case of a delivery service person, I don't go onto Uber Eats, Deliveroo, whatever, and say that I would like Marcus to deliver my food. They are supposed to be perfectly replaceable. That is the business model of these delivery services. And so this means that if you are actually literally replaceable via this platform intermediation, then you probably have a much worse bargaining position, which needs to be considered. Another thing that I think is extremely important to think about is, are there large capital requirements in order to become a platform worker? This is mostly critical when you think about Volt or Uber. Basically, if you need to have a car, for example, this is an extremely large capital requirement. And so what this means is that it really challenges the assumption of flexibility. If you had to take out a lease for a car, which in Europe, at least, it has very high standards. It must be, I think, maybe 3 years old, have a certain minimum number of horsepower and so on, right? This is a very large expense which you can shoulder. That means that you're less free to walk away from the platform and to seek other alternatives in the marketplace. So I think this is very important, and I hear it very little discussed, but capital requirements are another thing which make me think more organization, more attention is merited. And the other thing which I think is super important to think about if collective bargaining is appropriate is the question of, is individual bargaining possible or appropriate? And the reason why I say this is because in many types of platform work, including the types of platform work which occur on location, you have a genuine bargaining process between the worker and the client. I think that if the worker is able to set their own price and they're being chosen from a list of other workers offering a different type of experience, saying that I'm specialized in X, Y, and Z, I have 5 years of experience with this, I've got a 4.9 rating, right? It raises other issues, but certainly this indicates that individual bargaining is taking place within this market. And I think that that can be extremely important to think about. In some cases, there's genuine competition between these individuals working on a platform, which makes me think that there's less of a chance that they're going to feel solidarity. There's much less chance that they're going to want to organize collectively versus the platform, for example. It makes much less sense when there's some kind of additional dynamic, right? Of course, it's also important to think about the characteristics of the legal system and of the industrial context in a given country. And unfortunately, this is a huge mess if you look at the European Union. It's very different. You can even have clusters, as we saw in one of the previous presentations, where some countries are more and less similar. But still, it's much more difficult to think about a European Union-wide approach to collective bargaining for platform workers, given how different the industrial histories and industrial contexts are across many different countries. And I also really appreciated the comment from Kyra Holtz earlier, who simply asked the question, have you asked the platform workers if they feel solidarity? Have you asked the platform workers if they would like a union, if they would like some additional form of representation? And I think that this should be pretty high up there when we think about, is organization or further forms of worker organization appropriate to tackle problems X, Y, and Z? If the workers are not going for it, or if they don't seem amenable to it, that's probably a reason why we should think about other solutions, which in my opinion, we should be leaning towards EU-wide legislative solutions for a number of different issues. among these are things which Uma was just bringing up, particularly concerning algorithmic management. And I think that there's also been some excellent research on 2 European Union pieces of legislation, being GDPR and P2B, platform to business regulation. There have been a number of different papers. We had one that came out, I believe, in late 2019, early 2020, which really looked very closely at these 2 pieces of legislation, trying to understand what kind of impact they can have for platform workers. But this is especially important because P2B and GDPR, they can have an impact for all platform workers because they have the potential to solve procedural issues. When I say procedural issues, I talk about, for example, you wake up one day, look at your Uber app on the phone, you realize that you've been suspended from the app and you don't have any way to challenge this, or you realize that you've completed a contract, I don't know, as a graphic designer, you sent off your completed work to the client, and for some obscure reason, your work was rejected, you don't receive any payment for your work. That's just unacceptable, right? But this is at the basis, these are a bit more, they can be just simply technical problems or what you might call procedural problems, which affect all platform workers in various ways to various extents. These are the things that I look at and say, this is clearly unfair, and this is probably something that perhaps collective bargaining can address, but perhaps it's better addressed at a higher up level. And so this is something that I would like to think about here. Now, taking a step back, I said it's important that we think about not only the online versus on location delineation of platform workers, but also that we look at the taxi personal transportation services, the delivery logistics things. We should look at this in a very special box. And I say this in large part because although this represents a small number of the total number of platforms which intermediate labor, this represents a massive amount of revenue for both the companies and also for the people who earn via them, right? And so we had a paper, the main author was Willem-Pieter de Groen from CEPS. I was one of the co-authors. It came out a month or 2 ago, where we looked at the business models of various, or we tried to get all platforms active in the EU. We found that of the 7 billion euros that platform workers in the EU earned in 2019, 5 out of the 7 billion were for these taxi-like drivers or these food delivery riders. 5 out of 7 billion was for these particular types of platform work, which is a reason why, of course, we have more scrutiny for these services, right? For 2019, we saw a very steep drop in taxi-like services due to COVID, but we saw a bit of a rise for the food delivery services. So in 2020, in fact, half of all revenues, 3 out of 6 billion for platform workers earned in Europe, were for these taxi-like services or were for these food delivery services, right? So this is a reason why I think that these need to be in a separate box, and also because these types of work, the workers are not setting their own price. They are not bargaining individually with the client, which means that I think you need to look much more closely at these ones as it concerns collective bargaining as a potential solution to address fairness. I'd also say that even when we look at something that might be considered more homogeneous, like a crowd working, think about Amazon Mechanical Turk, think about any type of system where people are assigned to do data labeling, to do data entry, these sorts of things which are critical to AI, they've become a massive service purchased by companies the world over, right? Even here, we're seeing pretty big shifts, which can have big impacts for the workers. Now, by this, I mean, we have a sort of first generation of crowd work platform. This would be something like Amazon Mechanical Turk. Amazon Mechanical Turk, me and you could all go on and very quickly get ourselves a profile there, and theoretically, we could find work, right? And there's very little intermediation, there's very little quality control. But recently, due to different developments in AI and particular needs, such as autonomous vehicle driving, there's a greater demand for extremely high quality data labeling. And so these types of services that AMT is offering, they need to simply be better, right? And so we're seeing this second generation of crowd work emerge, which is much more controlled. There's a much more sort of normal relationship between a management, a middle management, and the worker. And in many cases, they're actually employing these workers who are becoming specialized in different types of data management, and different types of data recognition and so on, right? Yes. Yeah, I had 15 minutes, right? I think I have 60 seconds, right? Pretty, okay. So my only point being that we are seeing some very interesting developments in how platform work is changing. I'm hopeful that with some of these, we're going to see more of a shift away from this like, really quite awful system that's connected with Amazon Mechanical Turk to something that is perhaps a bit more like a traditional employment relationship. And this is something that I'm hopeful about. So with that, I will close. I could talk another 20 minutes, but I promised not to. So thank you for the time to speak. I hope we can have a bit of a discussion after.
Many thanks. So many thanks, Jess, also for this presentation. I also see that we already have some questions, but maybe we should now give the floor to Jamie Bootcock. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Lovely, thank you so much. And like Zach, I will also try and time myself, but of course these things get harder to do via Zoom, don't they? The first thing I want to say is thanks for the very kind introductions. I always find introductions to be quite an embarrassing thing to do, and what a great panel to be speaking on, and group of researchers for the wider project. There are a couple of things that I want to say, and I guess I want to start off by saying one of the things that I have been talking to other people about platform work recently is the increasing need to do exactly what this project is doing, which is to compare experiences in different countries or jurisdictions and really try to draw out how platform work or the gig economy, or whichever word we choose to use for this kind of experience of work, is shaped by the local national context, is shaped by existing labor movements or new labor movements, is shaped by existing or new regulation. And to kind of try and upset this notion that Uber is Uber everywhere, or that Deliveroo is Deliveroo everywhere, that these platforms have to adapt to local conditions in various ways. And in particular, that they are shaped by struggles of workers, both in their direct struggles and then in those kind of broader, let's call them social movement struggles or kind of political struggles that come into being. So yeah, the first thing I want to say is I think this is incredibly important. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to join the earlier sessions, but I did my homework and looked over the presentations, and it's really fantastic to see this kind of serious case study work being built up, because I think this is what is needed to move the debates around platform work forward. I also think the other thing that is needed, and I'm not trying to disagree with Uma, because I do agree that we should also look at the business side, but is to think seriously about what the implications of new forms of worker organizing or new forms of worker struggle mean in platform work, and attempt to theorize some of these things, both in terms of the struggles of workers on those platforms, but also in terms of how we make sense of contemporary trade unionism, how we make sense of what organizing looks like today. And I guess I want to start by saying I've been looking at platform work since 2016, since just before the first strike of platform workers in the UK. I'm aware, of course, quite keenly that I'm talking about a non-European country in the context of these European case studies, but I hope you will allow me to draw some comparisons either way. And I think it's sometimes quite useful to look back to the beginnings of these arguments around this work to, I guess, see what has changed, and also to think about some of the arguments that were made at the time and how they stack up today. And I remember very clearly meeting some of these delivery riders and then talking to other people about this work, and people saying they won't organize. They're too precarious, they're too young, the composition is too migrant, the work is too isolating, or whatever it would be. And I think one of the things we can reflect on is that those arguments have clearly disappeared. Nobody makes an argument that platform workers can't organize anymore. We've seen waves of strikes emerge, in Deliveroo, for example, spreading out across Europe, across mainland China, North, South America, almost everywhere there is platform work, there have been open struggles of various kinds. And I think in a way, the debate has moved on not to can workers organize or not, but instead to look at what forms of organizing are moving forward the struggles of these workers and are winning sustained changes, whether with a platform or through regulatory pressure or whatever it is. And I think what I want to spend my time talking a little bit about is how we can start to make sense of that, because, you know, in a selfish way, it's because I think this is the key question of where these things are going. And I want to riff a little bit off a book that I wrote recently, but I also want to say that a lot of my research comes not from me sitting on my own and trying to think up these ideas, but through co-writing projects with delivery riders or Uber drivers, with pieces of analysis from delivery drivers that I've helped them to write, through engaging in organizing with a union called IWGB in the UK, and through trying to understand how these arguments are not just academic arguments, but are also arguments that are part of the labor movement. That people are also discussing these things regularly on the streets and in meetings too. And I guess I just want to say, earlier this week, I think there was a kind of important moment in the UK, which I think confirms many of the things that both Uma and Zach have said about the way transport work is being organized, of a really wonderful demonstration of Uber drivers and Uber Eats couriers who decided to organize a joint demonstration to go to the Uber headquarters and talk about their shared concerns over deactivation. And of course, if anybody has watched IWGB demonstrations before, there were lots of flares and music and all sorts of very kind of lively demonstration. But for me, one of the best bits about that demo was seeing the speeches from drivers, both Uber drivers and then Uber Eats and Deliveroo and so on, who then went to have conversations with each other afterwards. You know, what have you been doing? What's worked? What hasn't worked? Which I think is a kind of wonderful moment of seeing how these riders are not isolated on their own platforms. You know, they find places to meet, they find places to share stories, but they're also not isolated between platforms. And in the UK, we've had some great moments too of Uber Eats riders talking to McDonald's workers and coordinating action together, because of course they see each other over and over again every day and have shared concerns. But the thing that I want to, the 3 points that I want to make are, the first is that, you know, I think we have to look at the details of this work to think about the kinds of dynamics of struggles that emerge from the work. And I think the first one, which hopefully I've emphasized enough, is that there are increasing connections between platform workers, which shows that they're not isolated. After the demonstration, I was having a look on Twitter to see what the reception was like, and an Uber driver from Southern Africa was getting in touch, saying this demonstration looks great. You know, there was also somebody from, I think it was Uganda, who was messaging the union saying, can we talk about tactics and so on? Is clearly there are these networks that are emerging, not only on a country basis, but internationally, because these things are eased by the fact all of these workers have to have a smartphone and have downtime where they can spend time searching for things online about their work. The second is that because of the bogus self-employment that I think has been mentioned already, many platforms refuse to provide proper communication to the workforce. And in my experience in London, what this has led to for many workers is, if you're not given proper training, if you're not given proper support in the work, you have to find other ways to figure out the work process and to overcome issues. And so these groups of workers, some of which become unions, some of which become organizing committees or whatever they are, begin from that problem of the labor process around communication. That people need to find other people to figure out where to meet, where are the best places to make money, what to do if things go wrong, and so on. That lack of communication, in a way, creates more communication between workers, but also leads to escalating action. In many workplaces, if you have an issue, You go and complain to a supervisor. You know, if your shift pattern doesn't work, you can complain to somebody. Often the supervisor won't do anything about it, but at least there's a kind of moment of interaction. For many platforms, the refusal to engage at all means that small grievances build quite quickly into larger grievances. And I think the deactivations issue is an excellent example of this. That once you start deactivating workers, refusing to communicate with them, people find other people with similar issues. It becomes more of a campaign. The platform refuses to engage, and workers have to look for more collective ways to deal with these things. And I think in a way, this is one of the reasons why wildcat strike action has become such a common form of collective action for these workers, which is certainly not the case in many other sectors in the UK or elsewhere, that wildcat strike action is a kind of core part of the repertoire of organizing. The third point that I want to make is about the internationalization of platform work. And I think I'm going to slightly contradict myself, which is always a good thing to do when you're just reaching the 10-minute mark of your promise of keeping to 10 minutes, is that although the different national contexts are important and shape this work in many ways, the internationalization of these platforms brings people together in new ways that doesn't happen in other kinds of work. An Uber driver identifies as an Uber driver in London, in Johannesburg, in Sao Paulo, and has a kind of shared sense of their work. A delivery rider has a similar dynamic. Is that there are increasing networks of international solidarity with coordinated strike action across borders, which is something that I think it would be much harder to envisage in other forms of low-paid work like cleaning or security guards or childminding, for example. And so there's a kind of new basis of solidarity that emerges on many of these platforms. And I guess the question that I want to leave, because I will try to keep into my time, is to say that this has a number of different expressions. One of the expressions is new unions like the IWGB, new alternative worker-led unions that are emerging. And this is the case in some countries. In others, large established unions have stepped in to either organize with or negotiate on behalf of these workers, which ironically is now happening in the UK too, with GMB signing a collective agreement with Uber, one that says that they won't discuss a whole number of issues, but perhaps we won't get into that debate. And I guess the other form perhaps is non-union forms, worker networks of some kind. And I think we're starting to see successes in all of these different forms. You know, some of them are winning some demands in some areas, some are winning some in others. And I guess the question is whether a kind of new labor movement emerges separate to the existing one, or whether the lessons of those new movements and new struggles can be brought into the existing labor movement in various ways. And I think that the model of, you know, which of these forms is successful and why is a really pressing issue for us to make sense of and understand. But I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Many thanks for this, yes, very inspiring presentation, which moreover is specifically focused on the research topic of this project. I think now we have almost 5 minutes left. Nuno, correct me if I'm wrong. So I think that we could take these 5 minutes to give you again the floor, and maybe you can have a final comment also after having listened to each other. You have addressed issues similar, you have highlighted some of the challenges and also some of the potential solutions based either on legislation, collective bargaining, or trade union action. So yeah, the floor is yours again. So if you want to give us a final comment, intervention, question, whatever you want. Yeah. Uma, the floor is yours.
Microphone.
Don't you think it would be better to ask if the colleagues have any questions before we get the floor? I'm happy to come in, but I just thought it's good to hear from others.
Okay, so any question in these 5 minutes? Reinhard, you had a question. You wrote something in the chat. Do you want to formulate this question?
No, sorry, I have no question. I just was writing my excuse that I have to leave in a minute.
Okay.
Okay, I don't mind going in. I think I cannot but agree.
Katie, you have a question? Yep. Katie, you can formulate your question.
Just a very tiny comment. I noticed that in all discussions, there's one thing that hasn't been mentioned at all. Maybe I missed this: the overwork. Because if we have cases where workers very clearly work up to 80 hours a week, but then we have those who are full-time students and work next to it, and then we have those who combine. In the end, actually, also in my research, I noticed that like every profile of every worker works a huge amount of hours a week. And I just wonder where is, and it seems to be kind of partly voluntary. Well, depends on the context maybe. And I just wonder where is this leading us? Because there is enough research to tell us what overwork may, what kind of impact it has on our health and social life and on our families. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So now, Uma.
Pablo, happy to take this. And I also agree with what Zach and Jamie have said. And I'd just like to raise one point with regard to it before I go there. Kari, that was a very interesting point that you raised, which was also shown in one of the slides that I presented with regard to the taxi drivers, where workers work about almost close to 80 hours. Now, the reason why they do that is part of the reason is to have the earnings that they need or desire to have, the so-called minimum incomes. The second thing is the whole gamification process that happens as a result of these platforms, whether it is delivery or in taxi, much more. Where if you do a certain number of hours, then you have all these bonuses, incentives that you actually get. And workers do get attracted to it and they go about earning it because that, as you see, is a substantial amount of money for a majority of the workers, about more than 70% of the workers, at least in the surveys we did. Now, this has huge implications on their health. Many of them have reported saying they've had accidents. So there are safety concerns and issues that have come by. And the entire issue of working time arrangement, where does that fit into this entire thing? So that's one of the reasons why I do think that there is a need to get our strategies and get our mechanisms going on with regard to what needs to be done from the worker side. I think there is a fundamental thing, according to me, where it's important to actually touch and handle the business model itself, where you do not allow the businesses to actually allow these practices and these huge subsidies. Like, I think one of the things we don't take into consideration is that much of the platforms, irrespective of which sector you're talking about, they're heavily funded by venture capital funds. And none of these platforms are actually getting any profits. And you're subsidizing all of this with venture capital funds, hoping that there will be a sort of a winner one day. And this is not sustainable in a long term. The business model is not sustainable. This is not sustainable for workers per se. And I think this is something that I'm hoping that the legislative processes that are going to come up by the end of the year, at least in the EU, will take care of it and address it. I liked what Jamie actually said about new forms of unions and workers. I think I'm very happy to hear more of that because even within the traditional sector, the informal economy workers were often left out. They didn't necessarily have organized unions. And I think they came up with their own collectives and forms of unionization to actually address their concerns and take them to different bodies to actually address them. But what's very interesting with the platform economy is how the different social media platforms have given them a kind of a space to actually organize and to make it much more effective. And I think what he's saying within that context of the internationalizing of a workers' movement is something really very, very new that you see. Well, I do know similar kind of internationalization of movements within the informal economy, where whether it's a women in informal employment or organizing and globalizing have tried to do, or the Seva in India has gone about actually organizing informal workers have done. There have been certain initiatives for home-based workers, domestic workers, and certain sets of informal workers, but the scale at which it can be done now among platform worker associations is far, far beyond than what we have seen earlier. So I think that's a very, very positive movement I would see with the workers. Thank you very much.
Well, I think we are almost out of time. Can we give the floor to Zachary, Nuno, and to Jamie for a final comment? Yep.
I'll just have a very quick comment. One thing that I discovered, or let's say like we discovered in a previous project, is that we acquired a bunch of data about workers, literally worker profiles from a number of different websites. One of the things we found in looking through a number of the big sites, like Fiverr, Guru, looked in Upwork and a few others, right? On a big site, namely Guru, for these types of freelancer services, for lack of a better word, of all the people who made themselves a profile, fewer than 1% of them had ever earned a single dollar or euro or whatever on this platform, less than 1%, which to me indicates that this is not really a source of income for as many people as we might think it is, or simultaneously, these people that have a profile on Guru simultaneously must have one on Fiverr and on Upwork and on Freelancer, maybe a full-time or part-time job on the side of this, right? And so for me, if we're thinking about the platform as the employer, I think that this sort of like real world data finding, it needs to, if we were to think about different forms of global or international, whatever organization as a solution where the platform is akin to the old world employer in this sort of normal industrial relationship, I think it becomes much more complicated. And I think that this is, although I think that there is a reason to look still at, in particular scenarios, why collective bargaining is the thing to look for. I think that in many forms of the purely online work, it is less compelling to me, certainly to get a quick solution which helps the most people in a timely fashion. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Zachary. Jamie, any final comment?
I just have one very, very short comment in response to Kyra's question, which I think overwork is always a very, very difficult issue. And I think most of the people that I've spoken to who do this kind of work are very hostile to any idea of limiting how much work people can do. This is a very common thing with couriers, many couriers who then work for Deliveroo. There's a sense of, I can work these very, very long hours and make lots of money. And so I think we need to be careful sometimes when we formulate suggestions that the solution to overwork is people being paid more. If people are paid more, they can work less. Some people will still choose to work more because they know that they can earn more. But I think we have to put in place things the other way around rather than putting limits on how much people can work, like change the environment. And then there will still be some people who want to be the biggest earner and work too much, but everybody else will be more protected.
Okay, many thanks. It has been indeed a pleasure for this very nice presentation and final comments. So many thanks. And hopefully we can meet again on another occasion physically. So Nuno, the floor is yours again.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we are finalizing the very long day with fatigue getting in. We should only make a very small closing session with team leaders of each team, starting by me and then Pablo, Linda, and Chava also. I would just like to say that this was a very difficult research project to conduct. especially from the starting of the pandemic. We had a conference that was already organized in Karlsruhe. We had to cancel it in the last minute. It was very difficult. Also, then we wanted to go to do field work, and suddenly everybody were reorganizing their personal lives and professional lives and making things from home. And so we had to extend a little bit our project. So from the point of view of the organizers, I think I can say that it was difficult to manage in that sense. I hope our results were not heavily influenced by these difficulties that we faced. We were able to make all deliverables. There's just one to go in September, which is a book that will be publicly available, and with the main findings. And so I would like to take this time to thank very much our partners, all the efforts they did. Also my colleagues, of course, Antonio Muniz, Isabel Roque, and others who are not here anymore. I also would like to thank the audience and those colleagues who were able to join us in this roundtable, keynote speaker, and just listen to our presentations. Thank you very much to all of you to participate and make this project success. So I won't take longer than this, but just to say that from the bottom of my heart, thank you very much for your collaboration. So I just pass the word quickly to Pablo so that if you want to add something.
Well, yes, many thanks. As you said, I think it has been a very challenging project because of the, pandemic crisis, particularly for conducting the field work. This has been very complex. So I would like to say thank you to Nuno in particular, but also to Antonio for the coordination and for the good spirit in these very difficult times. I think it has been very complex to coordinate the teams online and and all the activities. So many thanks for all this work. And there is also one additional difficulty, particularly in Spain, but in all the countries. But from our research, we started with, as Jamie said, almost the first demonstration in the delivery food sector, also in the ride-hailing sector, and the topic was very hot. And we have ended the project with the first legislation in Europe, which has recognized the presumption of employment for food delivery platform workers. And as Juan said, yesterday, Globo, the main food delivery company, said that it's created a new model which will be able to rely on genuine self-employment. So we will see. So the topic is really changing every day. So it's very difficult from a research point of view to really be able to analyze, because everything is changing. Also, trade union strategies are adapting, even if they are very creative. So yes, the thing is that we need to still continue researching, and it's difficult, but it's also very passionate to do this. So many thanks for having had the opportunity to do this research. Thank you.
Linda?
Yeah, I have to say something in a similar direction. I was in charge of organizing the Karlsruhe conference. It was just in the beginning of the COVID crisis, and I was not thinking that it would not happen. So we were so much kind of used to this international cooperation being in a physical idea. So it was really a shock, and it was also for our research work. We really had to adapt to digital meetings, to digital interviews, and so on. So we really came into this phase of COVID crisis also with regard to our research techniques and meeting techniques. But we were all experimenting, and also thanks to Nuno and Antonio for the coordination and also allowing us for a little bit more time for our research. I think that was very wise that we did use more time for field work also, so that we could also play full potential out of what we did. Coming from and I think it was so nice having our own impressions and also the keynote and the comments from the roundtable. For me, I also learned so much more about setting the German case into a bigger context. And I think it's in 3 parts. So I learned a lot about the differences between hidden and visible platform work. I think this is a very, very important distinction also for Germany, where we have hidden platform work and care work, and also very visible platform work, for example, with Lieferando. I think this is a very, very important distinction. Then the context specificness, which was highlighted so much, I think it's true for nationalities and also for sectors, and it makes so difficult to make also our comparison or come to joint recommendations. So it's really the challenge to be that context specific and general at the same time in order to raise voice. And the third point I want to make is the public attention to platform work, which Ursula Huws also said, that we need the public attention to platform work, but it cannot be restricted to platform work. It has to be on the good for all workers. And I mean, I told a little bit that in Germany now it's discussed that food delivery is no longer platform work. And I said, well, it might be a danger because the public attention might go away from that. And maybe this might be also the starting point to change again the definition of platform work, that it's not only the employment model, but also even much more the platform model, so that we keep it in and really go for a kind of bigger idea how to shape good working relations in these type of specific work, which always are very, very differentiated and move on and so on. So thank you very much that we could be part of this interesting and exciting research, and I'm looking forward what it comes and brings. Thank you.
Salva. Microphone, Salva? Yeah. Microphone.
You are right, as usual, you know. I think following this long day and having the Zoom fatigue syndrome, I only very briefly would like to indicate two things. Following the excellent presentation of Ursula Huws, I think almost everybody agreed that platform work is a global phenomenon. And I think we have to be very careful to avoid, therefore, the risk of over generalization. And this project really indicated that we need much more effort to contextualize what we learned on the platform work. This is the one message. And how to carry out the continuous contextualization, I think we need researchers also and other actors developing network. Not only platform workers are needing the movement to create some cooperation, but I think it's very necessary in the field of research, because even in Europe, we spoke today the global, India, Brazil and other countries, but I would like to call your attention that even within Europe, we do not know, our knowledge rather modest on the diversity of the European countries. There is a knowledge deficiency, knowledge asymmetry between the old member state and the new member state, for instance. And therefore, I would like to share with you this idea in finishing this really fruitful cooperation. And thank you very much for everybody for the cooperation. Thank you very much.
Okay, Xava, thank you very much for your wise words once again. So I take this opportunity to close the conference and to thank you all for remaining with us until the end and participating and contributing to the discussion. Thank you very much, and have a good day.